We are here for the last part of The Orchard Keeper. And of course, after part number 4, I'm going to be dropping some videos on writing in The Orchard Keeper and have done some different theoretical analyses. But this is the last of our close reading of the text. And this has been such a fun journey so far. It's taken me much longer than expected because I've honestly just been savoring the book. And it's been influential on my life in weird ways the last couple months. But hopping into the text, this starts with a storm, and McCarthy loves in this novel to use the classic storm as an ominous foreshadowing of something bad to come. This happened earlier with Arthur looking at the government tank and the lightning, and something similar is happening here at the start of the novel. Excuse me, at the start of part number 4. And we also see some very awesome interplay between Arthur, Marion, Mildred Ratner, and a cat's point of view. We experience them all of them within 4 or 5 pages. And McCarthy is no stranger to wanting to write from animals' point of views because he tried to do that in the early drafts of The Crossing. But this is really the largest instance of writing from an animal's point of view in McCarthy's work, which is just awesome. And he gets into it for a couple sentences in The Crossing and a little in small sections in other books. So let's read a little bit of that because I think it's just really awesome for just the scholarship in general. So it's starting at the bottom of this page here, and I guess I should explain what happens before this. So there's a storm going on, and Arthur's walking around, and he goes into his outhouse, and there's a cat also in the outhouse, and it scares him. McCarthy used the word Valkyrie and all this stuff, and we know that Arthur kind of has this crazy relationship with the cat kingdom. And so it scares him, and the cat goes away and is wandering through the storm, seeming very tired and hunted. And eventually it comes upon Mildred Ratner's house and starts eating some pork. But eventually she catches it and scares it off. And that's where that kind of leads us up to this point I'm about to read. In Tipton's field, 4 crows sat in the black locust, range upon the barren limbs with heads low between their wing blades, surveying the silver gray desolation, the silent rain in the country. They watched the cat come across, and we're talking from a crow's point of view here, interestingly. The field at a slow lope, an erratic dancing progress where she veered and leapt, keeping to the spotty dry ground. Their calls in the afternoon stillness had a somber loneliness about them, the mournful quality of freight whistles. They came from the roost and defiled low over her head, dipping and swooping. The cat spun low on her haunches, batted at them. So did they harry her out of the field, her pausing at each attack to make a stand and grapple at the wind of their passage? Hard pressed to preserve dignity, the birds flaring, wheeling, setting it to again in high crude humor. So I am feeling like the cat in general is kind of this metaphor to the unwelcomeness that a lot of the characters are feeling. Mildred, Marion, John, and Arthur are all lonely. They are all lonely in this new world that has taken something from them. Arthur being a wife being taken from a traveling salesman, John's father and life, father and life being taken from him because of the industrialization and the push for money that Marion had to go and do so they didn't have to go work in a factory. And then, Mildred suffering very similar consequences. So the plight of the cat is, I feel like, somewhat metaphorical here. And the crows who exist outside of all of this as a trickster animal, crows, ravens, coyotes are kind of the famous tricksters of the, America in general. I think those would be the top 3. And they are messing with the cat. And this seemingly is like the gods or like a higher power just like laughing at, the useless plight of this cat. Eventually, this cat comes upon one of John Wesley's traps out near the Tipton farm and finds one of its minks. But as she is starting to, examine the mink, thinking about eating it, something catches her eye, and it's actually an owl. She feels like she's being hunted still. Something is going on, so she decides to move on. And there's this very just sad line here at the right here. And if you've already read it, we already know. I guess I can just sit here and talk about this. You've already read chapter number 4. So the cat dies, right? The cat gets carried off by the owl. We already talked about that a little bit. That's coming in like 30 pages, and this is setting up that scene, if you didn't already know that. So I'm acting like I can't spoil anything here, but this is the end of the novel. We're done. I've been holding back this entire time. I should, do a whole reread of all this again with like just being able to speak about spoilers this entire time because like there's all this stuff about Arthur eventually going crazy that I've just kind of refrained from mentioning and all the, the stuff happening at the end of the novel. So if we look at this last paragraph, the rain had plastered down her fur and she looked very thin and forlorn. She gathered burdock and the curling purple leaves of rabbitweed as she went. A dead stalk of blackberry briar clung to her hind leg. Right here is also a very interesting use of a semicolon. Cormac is somewhat rare in his use of semicolons. And let's analyze this really fast while we got some time. So she gathered burdock and the curling purple leaves of rabbitweed as she went. And just for a quick reference, burdock is just the spiky things that, cling on to you no matter where you're on the world. There's always those little spiky things that catch on you. And this white plant right here, which is apparently rabbitweed, seems to be something similar. So we have that initial clause, and then the second clause that's connected with a semicolon. A dead stalk of blackberry briar clung to her hind leg. I guess that's a decent use. We could put an and there, the comma, but I guess it would impede the flow a little bit. So I think that's a decent use of a semicolon. Cormac must have thought so. And something very interesting to note I just looked up. I'm going to have to do a full analysis of this at a later time. But Carthy in this novel uses 54 semicolons, but in The Passenger, he uses 0. So I'm going to do a video on that. I think that's really cool, looking at the number of semicolons used throughout all of his novels. But at this point, he really hadn't come up with that thesis yet that semicolons are this terrible thing. I actually haven't noticed that too much yet. But apparently we've passed by, 40 or so semicolons so far. Moving on, she squalled once, hugging the ground with her belly, eyes turned upward at the colorless sky and the endless pelting rain. And a squall is a cry. So she puts her belly down on the ground in that crouched position and kind of cries once. And this is very sad. I mean, this is very, once again, kind of reminiscent of what's going on in the story. So after this scene, we transition to a very long, overly descriptive scene of John Wesley Ratner going and checking the trap. And Cormac will do anything except say there was a mink in the trap, but we know through an indication that he grabs it with the fur and eventually it was submerged in water because of multiple days of rain, that he is going and checking his trap seemingly for the same mink that the cat just was looking for, was at. So in our next scene, we transition to Marion, who we've been kind of following for a little bit now. And he goes and gets some gas at a store with Mr. Eller. And there are some cats there. And I actually go into this a lot more in my Orchard Keeper and Cats video. So go check that out. If you want a full analysis of this section, I've already kind of done it. No really need to do it again. Okay, so I think the whole point of this section is to show us that Marion's car is just a piece of shit, and he is just reluctant to change this. This is like if I was a crack dealer and I just drove around town saying on the side of my car, I am a crack dealer, and thinking to myself, well, I drive around town all the time and I never see the police. They're never on the side of my car, so I'll never get caught. That's what happens. This is now the third time in the story that he's having car problems. The first one being where the car has a flat tire and him and Kenneth Ratner, he has to kill Kenneth Ratner. The second where he crashes the car off the bridge. Like, he is not just a bad driver. He has car problems all around. And when things aren't going your way like this, there's something wrong. There's like, usually when you move into improbability, like you've entered the spiritual world and it's time to like fall back. Sometimes the universe gives you a big no, and if you reject that after multiple warnings, then you're going to get slapped, and that's what ends up happening to, Marion in a little bit because of his car. And I guess this is just a big critique of the car in general, but you just can't help to wonder, like, this is not very good decision making here, Marion. And so let's read this italicized section that ends this little section, though. Let's read the second paragraph. The wind had died, and the night woods in their faintly breathing quietude held no sound, but the kind of rainfall, track of water beads on a branch, their measured fall in a leaf pool. With grass in his mouth, the old man sat up and peered about him, heard the rain mendicant voiced, soft chanting in that dark gray mare that summons the earth to bridehood. And that last sentence, soft chanting in that grammar, excuse me, I'm being an idiot. Gramarye, and that is magic, necromancy, soft chanting, and that dark magic that summons the earth to bridehood. So this is kind of a different take on the rain, saying that there was this recess, right? That this was, even though it was a dark foreshadowing, nothing could really happen during this time of rain. Everyone had to come indoors. But now we are now moving on to a different stage of the novel. We're moving towards kind of the climax here. There, the earth and the magic of the land and of action is now coming back to us in the sunlight. So literally the next line starts, they came 3 times for the old man. And unfortunately, it's not that they suspected him of shooting the government tank, which they probably did. Maybe they're slightly coming for that, but they suspect Arthur for whiskey bootlegging from what I've read into this, and him being an accomplice to this. So the first time they knock on the door and it opens up and it's like an old Western movie. And he's got the shotgun pointed at him and they scramble. The second time they come back with a full force. And man, imagine back in those days. I mean, it still happens now, but it was much more hardcore then. Like now we come in with a SWAT team, and if it's just some random crazy, usually they can make it through with body armor and not get hurt a lot of the time. But back in the day, it was, just a bunch of random guys with guns with, the same training as the dude inside, but just without shelter, trying to, get him out of the house. And that's why you get in these really funky shootouts. I mean, these have been going on since the start of guns, even the start of time. Singular house siege warfare. I don't know if you guys know about, this just came to mind. John Brown, the guy in the Civil War, pre-Civil War in Kansas, who was going around killing slave owners and causing havoc. He eventually tries to take over like a military ammunition depot and cause a slave rebellion, and he's stuck and sieged up in this house, and the crew that comes and gets him out is led by none other than Robert E. Lee, which is just a random fact of history, which is super funny. Well, maybe it's not funny, but so they try and eventually raid the house in the classic fashion, but of course, it's very easy to see someone coming, and so Arthur just times 2 deputies coming in and shoots them both. And we don't, I think, end up know what happens to them, but they probably die or it's seriously injured, and the men leave. And this is just one of these things, I'm just going to speak off on a cuff here. It's just such a sad part of American history that people getting ripped off their land by the fucking police. I am only sympathetic to the police when it comes to them rounding up, violent people, actually like violent people, but them coming and making a mockery and showing up with guns for a suspected whiskey bootlegger on someone's property. Today we just get swatted and we have to just kind of take it. But like, I see no problem in defending yourself. They are just citizens who are coming to mess with you and lock you up in a steel cage and like put you through a court system and like do all this stuff. And as for someone who doesn't believe in drug laws or, and believes in the freedom to experiment with their own consciousness and really the ability to do anything except hurt other sentient beings, it's just been made a mockery of. I've known so many friends who were in the game, and one day a bunch of men show up with machine guns to their house and are pointing guns at their family and like ripping their whole house apart. And today, like I said, we're used to it. I'm conditioned. I'm a good conditioned man now. Like we've took it so many times on the chin. Like we've been conditioned. But back in the day, imagine these poor people who have been living in freedom, who came to America for freedom, and a bunch of random jerk off cops are coming and, going to take you away when you're in your 90s. Imagine, I'm imagining my, late grandfather who was in his 90s. It's just not right, and it breeds bad people. If you are the type of person to go and try and kill and attack a 90-year-old man for suspected bootlegging, you just can't be that good of a person. You may do good things like rounding up Lester Ballard, when he's going crazy in a couple years, and that's great. But I just think of all the people that, who got thrown off their land and took a stand, during this time with eminent domain. People loved their life. People loved where they lived. They had buried their families on there. And they, went down not without a fight. And now it's been basically controlled now with body armor, machine guns, and tactical surveillance and like cameras on little, RV things. You can get into a house and basically minimize the risk of death. But that was the whole point back in the day, that if you really wanted to do this, you actually had to care that this was something hardcore. If you were going to bring charges and rip someone off of their land, it's got to be important. And while we're out here, I'm not nostalgic to think that we can return to this way of life, that we can return there's so much land out there. I know a lot of it's owned by the government and it's been bought up, and our whole economy and jobs and government and welfare system are tied, and education system are tied down economically, but it wouldn't be that hard to transition out. But it would be hard for the people in power, and it's hard to let go. It would make us so much happier. I'm staring at a wall right now of another house. Like, this is the view. Much rather be seeing an expansive property of my own that I was working on every single day and thinking about and raise my kids on, be buried on. And right now with the acreage in America, every single American human, not even family, could have 7 acres each. We could all have over 7 acres each. I know some of that's unusable. Even 3 acres. 3 acres is a lot of land. And if we're talking about families, there could still be a ton of national parks and open land if there were multiple people on one of those properties. But instead, we get 10,000 square feet of land, for a property. Unless you're in an apartment, then you're just in this, vertical building. Excuse me, my numbers were wrong. With livable land, every human could actually have in the United States 16 acres of land each. Who knows what the numbers are, but you guys get the point. And so Arthur gets in this shootout and they leave. And Arthur has to gather up his things now. He has to flee. And this is just such a sad part of the novel. Remember when I was first reading this, I was like, God damn, this sucks. And if we read starting at the top, the old dog came from under the porch, peering with blue, roomy eyes at the indistinct world of shapes. The old man called again and the dog started for the road, hobbling stiffly. And they set out together, south along the road, until they were faint and pale shapes in the rain. And once again, just how sad is this? This was a common thing for all the people in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park who got thrown off their land. Where do you go when you're homeless? To put all the stuff on your back and you just got to start walking. And I don't like to critique strategy too much. I mean, because, this is a random old guy in a fictional novel. But him going on foot and eventually being offered a ride by a couple men is a really good opportunity for him to get out of town. I mean, he could have packed lighter and just gotten really far away and probably been able to live his life a little bit easier. I mean, staying in that general area, even though it's his homeland when he's on the run, is a pretty bad move. He's smart enough to be able to shoot these guys, but they're probably not going to be looking for him outside of Knoxville city limits, and he has no home anyway. If he's going to go hole up in some random forest and try to make ends meet by doing random things, go do it where no one's going to recognize you and the police aren't there. But I guess his pride is too much to be accepting these rides and trying to hitchhike and do the journey that way. But this was a time, if you see a man in his 90s, it would be more than probable that you'd pick him up. Especially, if he goes down to Knoxville too, if he can get into the city where they probably don't know him very well, maybe, and within the day he'd be able to get a ride outside of town and be gone forever. Move to a better place, where maybe the land would be more forgiving to him in the winter, moving a little bit south or something. But Arthur's all going to a very extreme place. They're calling it is a very hardcore place. And I did some research, everyone, and I figured out that Hurricane is actually pronounced and is actually being spelled hurricane. I don't know how you guys say it. And it is an area in the northwestern part of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And so if we return to our trusty map over here, he starts right here where my mouse is circling, and he starts to walk over the mountains to around this area, seemingly. There's a red mountain right here. If we look at the map, there's some mountains right here. So he ends up right around this area during this time. And Hurricane is just right up the road. It's not too far out of town. It's just right at the northwest corner. So he was still in contact. As we know, we end up knowing he gets caught. He's still in contact right here. And if you're listening to the audio, he's walked what I'm calculating to be around 20 miles. So it's probably taken him a while. Well, at this point, he's really walked about 12 miles or so. And the journey is going to be up to 20 miles long. Also of note, in William Gay's novel Twilight, he describes this area, saying, quote, "It was called the Hurricane long before the 30s, when the tornado cut a swath through it. Folks called the tornado a hurricane, one fierce storm the same to them as another. This one came up through Alabama in 1933 and set down in the hurricane as if it had been its ticket punched for there all along." So now we're at the Arthur Ownby arrest scene, which is absolutely terrible. And rereading the section again right now, my suspicions are concluded that he is up there in that northwest area of the Smoky Mountains, because that exact area is next to this River Creek thing that's pretty big that he crosses while he's going back to camp. So during this arrest sequence, there's a police officer staked out for an entire week there, which is kind of overkill if we're examining how big of a crime this is, if you know what I mean. Like, I so assume he must have killed someone or actually hit him pretty well if they're coming after him this hard, putting a man out for a week on a post to look for him. So the officer arrests Arthur finally, and it's such a sad scene. I mean, this is my least favorite and favorite part of the book, because they pick him up and he doesn't want to go, and he wants to bring Scout with him. And Scout's this old blind dog that he's had for over a decade now, but from what he said, close to 15 years since he was a puppy. And he knows he's going away for a while. And I guess he should have planned for this and given the dog to someone else. But you hate to see it. And the last line of this is brutal. We're going to start right here. Long rattling curve, and we're on the road and leaving. And the old man, clutching his cane, holding the dirty little sack between his knees, looked back at the dog, still standing there like some atavistic symbol or brute herald of all the questions ever pressed upon humanity and beyond understanding, until the dog raised his head to clear the folds above his milky eyes and set out behind them at a staggering trot. And that's just absolutely brutal. I mean, that's as savage of a line for John Brown, savage of a line as you're going to get by Cormac McCarthy. I mean, he's always known how to do this. This is something in a lot of the novels, The Crossing, All the Pretty Horses, Cities of the Plains, Blood Meridian. I mean, almost all of them. He knows how to make you uncomfortable. And I guess that's just pulling on the strings, tragedy in general. And the use of animals is just a good way to get anyone going. But Cormac connecting it to the ancient symbols and questions that we're all asking, that there's this dog, this loyal dog that's very old looking back at you as you're going off to the loony bin. It's pretty good contrast and depth here. And so around this same time in the next chapter, Marion has been arrested too. And Marion has been arrested for not paying his taxes on whiskey bootlegging. And we learn that he is 28 years old and not married, which is another interesting note. And so John comes and visits him in the jailhouse. And so Marion and John start to have this very candid and fatherly son conversation, but it takes some weird turns. First of all, John wants to get retribution on Gifford, the police officer that's been messing with Marion and tracking him down. And Marion's like, nah, man, we're square. Like, that's his job. He's just making a living out there. And we're all square. You, me, and him are square. And John actually gives him $2 to be like, we're square now. And it's very it was very heartwarming, because like John has a lot of guilt thinking that he got him into jail, that if it wasn't for him, that none of this would have ever happened. And he doesn't want this mentor figure to be in jail. Like, this doesn't look good. And Marion tries to reassure John and says, quote, "It's his job. It's what he gets paid for, to arrest people that break the law. And I didn't just break the law. I made a living at it." He leaned forward and looked at the boy in the face. "More money in 3 hours than a working man makes in a week. Why is that? Because it's harder work? No. Because a man who makes a living doing something that has to get him in jail sooner or later has to be paid for the jail. Has to be paid in advance, not just for his time breaking the law, but for the time he has to build when he gets caught at it. So I've been paid. Gifford's been paid. Nobody owes nobody." And Marion says a very interesting line. He says that there are no more heroes. And this is like a very big theme in McCarthy's literature. And he's not too outright with it very often. But there are no more heroes in this world, because without the blockade on whiskey by the politicians, crime wouldn't be legal. Like, everyone now has karmic retribution in this world. Marion for doing illegal things and killing Kenneth, Arthur for killing the cats, and John for starting to engage in hunting and illegal activity himself. And maybe just a curse of his blood, the Ratner blood, because you heard Marion say earlier that he's got bad blood, the sins of the father type stuff. And Marion is trying to dissuade him, because he says, the boy seemed to shrink, his face flushing when he says, "I don't want you to be a hero for me." And sometimes this is something hard that you have to do, when someone who admires you and stuff, you have to push him back and put him down, because that hero worship isn't good. And so Marion sends him off with that. But then we get this beautiful last note from Marion that says That's not true what I said. It was a damn lie, every word. He's a rogue, an outlaw himself, and you are welcome to shoot him, burn him down in his bed, any damn thing, because he's a traitor to boot. And maybe a man steals from greed or murders in anger, but he sells his own neighbors out for money, and it's few lied that deep in the pit. That's far beyond the pale. And that's somewhat a sly reference to Kenneth Ratner, being in the pit. And that's who he's comparing him to. He's comparing the police force, people that sell out their own neighbors, because that's what they're doing. They're people in the community who are arresting guys like him, and he's seeing it as a massive blow. And it's interesting that his father was a lawyer and his brother, because lawyers are the funnel to police. I mean, they're all inherently connected, just how nurses and doctors are connected to pharmaceutical companies and whatnot. And, in police to weapon systems, there's this kind of odd cohesion to it all. And as a smart, talented, rebellious man, McCarthy really didn't like that whole program. So in this next section, we get the cat's point of view again, and the cat's eventual death. And the cat has deep thoughts. I mean, it even gets to the point of a shadow passed soundlessly overhead, perhaps a flock of late returning birds. And it's obviously the owl. And this is symbolic to the three characters in the story, that they've been prancing around, but they've been getting weak. They've been ripped up by industrialization and society. And finally, at the end, it's such a beautiful writing right here. When she left the rocks, was clear of the overreaching branches of the tree, there grew about her a shadow in the darkness, like pooled ink spreading, a soft hissing feather bed sound which ceased even as she half turned. Saw unbelieving, the immense span of wings cupped downward, turned again, already squalling, when the owl struck her back like a falling rock. And then Mr. Eller hears the cries and sees the shadow of a cat flying overhead, but he can't see it, and it's the owl carrying off the cat to kill it and eat it. And that's actually a really common thing, because my roommate's cat got killed by an owl, and that's why I don't let my cats out anymore, because it's just a brutal world out there, and I'd rather not see him dead. I've known a lot of people, cats go missing, something happens, and it's like, man, that's an early death. But I understand that people have different opinions. But this is the killing of the spirit by the predator, and the owl has always been known as the nocturnal, apex predator. And it's not a secret that the Illuminati, whatever we want to call them, the powers that be, love the worship of the owl, because it is not always a dark occult symbol. It can also be a messenger of light, but it is a predator, and that's what they view themselves as. And that's why at Bohemian Grove, they burn the owl and worship Moloch. We don't need to get into the owl as much, but McCarthy is symbolizing it here with society. But as we're also about to see, McCarthy views this cat as Kenneth Ratner, everybody. Yes, I'm here to say it. And we are about to talk about that in this upcoming section, but I just have to get that in there to amp this up. Next, we return to our favorite, Mr. Arthur Omby, and he is now incarcerated. And he's being visited by a social worker who's trying to just ask him some basic questions. And what I get from this is that they're trying to send him to jail, first and foremost, to prison, Brushy Mountain, where Marion is located. And he ended up shooting 4 men, even though only 2 shots were fired. So I don't know how he got the other 2, maybe in the initial crossfire, but no one died from this. But, shooting 4 police officers, that's going to put you away for a while. But he, the social worker is trying to help him plead insanity. And him acting, he isn't acting wrong in this. Like, the guy's just asking dumb questions, and he's like, what's the point? Tell me the point. I don't need to be asking these dumb clarification questions. And this is just the old world. But for some reason, McCarthy is writing it, and from this guy's point of view, it's like reinforcing the idea that he is crazy. But inside Omby's head, he sees the end of his life, though, and his freedom. It's really sad. If we start down here, he sat very still with his hands on his knees, his shaggy head against the bricks, restored to patience and a look of tried and inviolate sanctity. The faded blue eyes looking out down the row of cages, a forest of sweating iron doles, forms of men standing or huddled upon their pallets, and the old man felt the circle of years closing, the final increment of the curve returning him again to the inchoate, the prismatic flux of sound and color wherein he had drifted once before, and now beyond the world of men. By the time the agent had gathered his forms and tucked them away once again in his briefcase. The old man had closed his eyes, and the agent called quietly for the jailer and left him. And so Ombi has resigned himself to his fate. He knows what he said, and he tells him, he's like, Brushy Mountain isn't the worst thing I've been a part of. That's nothing to compared to what I've gone through in my life. And that's one of the saddest things to see, man. Old people in prison, especially for stuff like this. You get a murder, serial killer or something, with 30 years down the road, then whatever. And the section where Arthur is in the nut house, the loony bin, whatever you want to call it, and John is coming to visit him, has some of the best writing of the novel. Long monologues rise and fall. They speak of great deeds and men and noble eras gone, the mowers returnal on the fence and marital formation, drowning the babble of voices. And the scariest line of all, the eldest of all sits a little apart, a grass stem revolving between his yellow teeth, remembering in the summer. And he's moving back to the past, just sitting there like, at least he gets to be outside and he's not in prison. But Arthur, a lot of this time, has been stuck in memory itself. He's kind of returned there because of his trauma and where he's at. But he used to be able to be active. He used to walk in the forest and think and be a part and integrated with nature. He knew how to survive in nature and make money, through trading. And so they get to talking, and Arthur says some very interesting things. First of all, he says that when you get older, you don't need to know the date or the seasons. You know the signs of the season. And more importantly, you know the weather. Because if you're trying to think about life in terms of agriculture or game, he says that there are signs that happen in the weather. It's all in the weather. It has nothing to do with the seasons or the forecast. Because I've experienced this before. There's been some years where there's been very little snow where I was living, or just kind of dramatic shifts in the weather. And it happens, according to Arthur, every 7 years, on the 7th year. And he starts kind of getting in his head. And this kind of shows that maybe he is a little bit kooky, but he's not that kooky. He still knows who John is, and Warren Polenham, John's friend. He still, remembers them by name. But he says he can't get used to the people in here, and that maybe when he isn't crazy, they might throw him in jail, but they don't know what to do with him. Because the way he's talking, the way he is, he really isn't crazy. I mean, he got accused of a false crime and fought back, but he may be crazy because he believes in werecats. He believes he's being haunted all night, and he's shooting stuff out, and he's shooting the government, taking these flashes. Like, behavior like that in the middle of nowhere really isn't that bad, but he is pretty close to Knoxville. I mean, when you're at 15, 20 minutes outside of town, that's still a little bit close for actions like this, and you may get in trouble. So now's the perfect time to tap into the transmigration of souls through cats with Cormac McCarthy here. And this creates problems for McCarthy in the drafting, because if you guys remember in an earlier scene, Arthur Omby thinks the man Ratner, when he sees him in the pit, has moved on, because I heard him high up and leaving out cat and all bound for hell most probably, and it squalled twice it, and that was the last I heard of it, and I hope not to hear it no more, never. And so that's, we feel like that's the ending, right? Like, okay, now that's the end of the cat, but there was problems with the cat. And McCarthy's editor, Albert Eskren, was starting to ask him questions. Like, for instance, he wrote, "Why have you placed the cat where it is after Ownby has been taken away?" and made Eller the one to hear it. And then McCarthy writes in his draft, "Something must be done about the cat. Shift cat scene." And in something very revelatory, Cormac writes, "Cat death should trigger general decline of everybody. 7 years, not up until August. Boy could hear the cat and tell old man about it. He could give his explanation, but the boy leaves in May or June, so the cat has to die before then." And there's a connection to the transmigration of the cat's soul when he says, "That's one cat I kept shy of. I know what it was. Lots of times that happens. A body dies and their soul takes up in a cat for a spell, especially somebody drowned or like that, where they don't get buried proper." And this could seem to indicate why the cat was milling around at Arthur Ownby's house after the escaped lightning strike and all that, but also his looking through his son's traps, and also eating dinner at his ex-wife's, whatever we want to call her's, house. And because it's been 7 years, the spirit should be gone now. He's working in these years of 7. And he says in this italicized section, right after that quote I just read, quote, but not for no longer than 7 years, so he would be gone now, and I don't have to fool with him no more, except he ought to not have got burnt. That ought not to have happened, and maybe I done wrong in that way to have let that happen. But it's done now, and he's gone. That had have been him Eller was supposed to have heard, wondering what all it could have been squalling that away. Not that I have told anybody.
him leaving out Cat and all and bound most probably for hell. And I hope they don't, and hope nobody hear no more from him, never. So that man put him there is either justified or not, is free to afore God, because after that 7 year they can't nobody bother you. What the lawyer said, and I had been scouted 9 years, he said was 2 year longer than needful, but this time I was too old and they catched me. And McCarthy had a problem with this rendition because he wanted to have the cat die 7 years after Ratner's death in August, but the timelines were so wonky that he couldn't work this out, and he was still trying to figure this out until like almost the moment of publication. And this kind of shows you how meta McCarthy was getting here. He was fumbling with the whole story, trying to just get this one thing in, something that would take someone, I don't think really no one's ever said this online before in terms of YouTube, but I've heard some scholars kind of talk about it. It's been 60 years since this novel has come out. It's how well embedded like some of these secrets and some of these ideas are. And this is also crazy because of the connection. This is just showing like the interconnectedness of this novel, which is so beautiful, because Ownby knows all this, but he doesn't know it's John Wesley's father who's bringing this up. He also doesn't know that Marion was with the cats, the dying cats, with Mr. Eller. Eller's the one who supposedly told him about all of this, because this happened after he got incarcerated, but he was friends with Eller, so Eller probably showed up. These are questions that McCarthy wanted to resolve, but wouldn't think some dude with a green screen on a high definition camera, in the future would be asking that, long after his death. And I wonder, Cormac just died. I wonder if he's transmigrated into the soul of some cat out there. Since Cormac died, some of my cats have been acting a little bit funky, so I'm going to have to maybe do some interrogation. It's interesting because Arthur tells John that seems like an old man may be allowed to rest, but then he comes to find there's things that you have to do on account of nobody else wants to attend to them. Like that would make them go away. And that one of the things he's talking about is the maintaining and the cutting of the cedar tree branch over Kenneth Ratner's body. During this exchange, he also, that is, Arthur contemplates the shooting of the government tank, saying, quote, or even knows they need attended to, but I never done it to benefit myself. Shot that thing. Like I kept peace for 7 years sake of a man I never knowed, nor seen his face, and like I seen them fellers never had no business there. And if I couldn't run 'em off, I could anyway let him know that they was one man would let on that he knowed what they was up to. But I knowed if they could build it, they could build it back, and I done it anyway. Every man loves peace, and an old man best of all. And there's a lot going on in this quote. But at the core, Ownby's trying to say that he's not a selfish man. He didn't shoot the government tank because he had a personal vendetta. It's because they were ruining everything. They had no business being there, and I couldn't run them off. That's why he also shot them. He also there was no benefit to him putting cedar tree branches over Kenneth Ratner's body, but he does. He continues to do it because he believes in the land, because he has a connection to it, because there's something that he has that they don't have. And he's a rebel without a cause because he knows that he could build it up. They would just keep rebuilding. Their force is impenetrable, but that doesn't matter because he had to make a stand to let everyone know. And it's a big statement because an old man loves peace most of all, but he was still willing to do his part in trying to save the community. And so the two depart from each other, and we are left now with no more Arthur and no more Marion. So we then transition to a scene where it's one of my favorites in the novel. John Wesley Ratner goes back to the Hawk Bounty office, and he gives the dollar back and says, hey, can I trade this? Please give me the hawk back. And she's like, it's been months. It's been, 9 months or so since you've been here. Why would I still have this hawk? And he feels like he owes it back because in his heart, he feels guilty about this was the start of the decline. Him taking that hawk led to the traps, and him helping Marion maybe just didn't help Marion escape from the police, but then led to him being caught for deeper bootlegging later, and Arthur Ownby being caught up in his own things because Marion's doing stuff on his property. Like all these different things are connected in his heart to this one moment. And he doesn't feel like the dollar was worth it because he now understands about the power of the machine and what that can do to you. He saw what happened to Marion, but he also saw what happened to Arthur, a man who betrayed nature and was at odds with it. And he doesn't want anything to do with that. He can't believe it. Who would have thought? But the authorities find through John Wesley Ratner, Kenneth Ratner's body. Supposedly, Mildred had some dreams or visions, or John Wesley comes across his body.
and we are unconfirmed if he knows it's his father or not, and then ditches town. But he also tells, or there's some rumor going around that in Kenneth Ratner's head, there's a titanium plate from the war, seemingly World War One, and it's worth some money. So they get the body and they cremate it, and there's no titanium plate. And we're dealing with the two officers from before, Legwater and Gifford, who really personify evil in the sense of this novel. I'm gonna have a video following up on that. And so Legwater goes up there and is digging for this titanium plate, and he doesn't find it. And there's a hound that's coming by and checking on him, and he's up at Orchard Road, right up. And I would have to assume that this hound is Scout, and so Scout the hound is up there, and eventually Gifford comes and gets Legwater, and they are leaving. And on the way back, Scout is sniffing up in the air, and Legwater kills Scout. He shoots him dead, and just at least we get a conclusion with Scout, which is, you know, at least somewhat good. So now we propel ourselves to the end of the novel, the final scene, and it's been years, and John Wesley Ratner comes back to visit his mother's grave. And while he's out there, a car drives by and he waves, and the people don't wave back, and this is the decline. And as he's leaving the cemetery, we learn, as I said before, that this is where they were cutting, and this is the moment in the prologue where they were cutting into the fence with the tree. And as he's leaving, it's very akin to Cities of the Plain, because the last paragraph reads, "They are gone now, fled, banished in death or exile, lost, undone. Over the land, sun and wind still move to burn and sway the trees, the grasses. No avatar, no scion, no vestige of the people remains. On the lips of the strange race that now dwells there, their names are myth, legend, dust." And McCarthy watched this happen. This is the most vulnerable homage to these men, the men that his father and everyone else drove out, because they weren't literate. They didn't tell their stories. A lot of the people moved away, moved back to the Northeast, went places. They didn't sit and listen to the old tales. We have a little bit of folklore, and we have McCarthy, who luckily we had write this novel, because without it, there are so many legends of this area and of this time that would have been captured. Faulkner, Joyce Carol Oates, all these people, they didn't capture it like McCarthy did, with the depth and interweaving it, the feeling with the emotions, the mood. They don't have it, and I'm just so grateful that Cormac spent the time to create such a layered piece of work on this. And so that concludes part number 4 of our close reading of the text. But now it's time for the theory. I'm going to be releasing, seemingly, judging from how much I've finished here, about 5 more hours or 4 to 5 more hours of theory video after this. So make sure to go check all of that out, because that's where we'll be diving deep. I'm planning to do some character analysis of the 3 main characters, and then doing some philosophical, psychological, pastoral critiques of the novel, and then seeing where we're at. And then, of course, some more videos on Cormac McCarthy's writing style on all of this stuff.